Hi, everyone. Thank you. Thank you for being here with us. I am truly honored on behalf of the Adam Smith Center for Economic Freedom to have this conversation with President Leonel Fernández of the Dominican Republic. We're going to have this as a conversation, but any great speaker deserves a great introduction. So Professor Eduardo Gamarra will do the honor of introducing President Fernández. Eduardo.
Thank you very much. Welcome to all of you. We're going to have President Fernández give us his vision of something that interests our class very much, Mr. President. I have with us a course called The Politics of Latin America. Most of the students here are undergraduate students, but with a great interest in Latin America. So I've known Dr. Fernández for, in fact, we were reminiscing this afternoon, about 40 years. And I guess that's saying a little bit about how, about our age. But I've known the president for many, many years. Had the privilege of working with him on a number of different important projects, and a lot of them in relationship to our university. This is, I don't know how many times the president has been here, but usually when the president comes here, he the first thing he does is he goes to the bookstore, and everybody in the bookstore knows him because he generally buys half of the collection there to take home. So the president served as president of the Dominican Republic from 1996 to 2000, and then from 2004 until 2012. He also is the founder of a very, very important think tank called the Global Foundation for Development and Democracy, based in Santo Domingo, but which has offices in several places. New York, for example, and now here in Miami. And of course, Jose is the director, and so if you would stand up. And we're working on doing we're developing some programs together as not only with your center, but also through the Latin American Center and the Gordon Institute here at FIU. So again, welcome to all, and Mr. President, again, a privilege to have you here. So now I'll turn it over to you for your.
Thank you, Eduardo. Thank you. All right. The president has been in many interviews, many academic settings. I think I first met him over 25 years ago when he came to give a talk at Harvard as president, and he gave a wonderful, academic talk. And I want to do something a little bit differently. I want to have a conversation with him not only as the former president of the Dominican Republic, but as Leonel. I want you to get to know the man behind the very important office that he held for 3 different periods, and who knows, might hold again at some point. He's eligible for 2 more terms, and so I want you to get to know him. And so I will ask a few questions about the Dominican Republic and about Latin America, about the U.S., but I also want to begin asking you about you, about your time in public service, about how you became interested in being a public servant. You've been in politics for a long time, so tell us, why politics, why public service?
Well, thank you, Carlos. Thank you, Professor Eduardo Gamarra, for your very kind introduction. Thanks to all of you for being here today. Well, let me tell you a little bit about that. I never thought of being a politician. I wanted to be a baseball player. That's what I wanted to be.
Tough competition from the Dominican Republic.
I came to New York when I was 8 years old, so I was raised in New York. And I used to go to Shea Stadium, right, where the Mets played all the National League baseball teams. And then we had a very high-profile Dominican ball player, the first Dominican to get into the Hall of Fame. His name is Juan Marichal. Mm-hmm. And I used to go to Shea Stadium to see Marichal pitching.
Who lives in Miami now.
Who lives in Miami now, that's right. And then I was really impressed. 45,000 fans at Shea Stadium, many of them waving the Dominican flag. So I associated sports with Dominican Republic while living in New York. So my first dream was becoming a baseball player. But I got into a deep slump. I was never able to get out of it, striking out all the time. So, a very early stage, I made the right decision to move forward into some other field. Interest perhaps in politics began at home in New York. My mother was a nurse, and also she worked as an operator, sewing machines in one of the factories in New York. And on weekdays, on Sundays or Saturdays, she will invite some of her friends that would come from other parts of New York, from Boston, where Dominicans used to live at the time. And they would speak about Dominican politics. And so I was 9, 10 years of age. I didn't pay much attention, but I know they were talking about Dominican politics. My mother was an avid reader. She would read Dominican newspapers, Dominican magazines, Dominican authors. So my family was always very much involved or interested in politics. But perhaps I would say the interest began when I returned to the Dominican Republic at the end of the 60s. Because I went into a neighborhood that really had an impact on me. That neighborhood called Villa Juana, in the capital city, Santo Domingo, most of the youth of the time was highly interested in politics and culture. So just about every night, they would go in the neighborhood, outdoors, and speak about different topics, basically about Dominican politics. So just coming from New York, more interested in baseball and sports in general, I began listening to them, and I was attracted by the way they spoke and the things they spoke about. So they began lending books, and so I began reading some of these books and became very much interested. I was beginning high school years. Most of these youngsters were already in college, and so they had an influence, creating an interest about Dominican politics. Of course, there was a natural environment to be interested in politics in the Dominican Republic at the time. We have had a long dictatorship from 1930 to 1961, Trujillo dictatorship. And then after that, we had Juan Bosch, who was the first democratically elected president after the dictatorship came down. And well, he was elected, he was overthrown by a military coup. In 1965, there was a popular uprising in the Dominican Republic to bring back Juan Bosch to power, but then it was the Cold War, and many analysts mistakenly thought it was going to be a second Cuba, which was not. It was more a democratic revolution that was taking place. And so there was a U.S. military intervention in the Dominican Republic in 1965. And so people were still talking about that intervention, and how we should regain our national sovereignty, our national identity as Dominicans. So there was a natural environment to speak about politics and become interested in politics and about culture, Dominican culture. I remember at the time I met the most important Dominican poet of the time, Pedro Mir. He would come to the neighborhood and speak and lecture, and so we were able to really get in touch with these kind of people that influenced my generation. So the interest, I would say, becoming aware about the importance of politics in the Dominican Republic began in my neighborhood. Now, officially, I began participating when I entered the university in 1971. Autonomous University of Santo Domingo, UAST in Spanish. And they had student groups. But those student groups were more linked to political parties, not like here in the US. You have a students' association, but it's more academics. It's more academic here, what students do. In the DR at the time, it was more political. So I began participating in a movement called Frente Universitario Socialista Democrático FUST, a social democratic students front. But it was linked to a party, the Dominican Revolutionary Party. So we began participating there. Juan Bosch returned to the Dominican Republic beginning the 70s, and he began speaking daily on radio, half an hour every day. He would speak not like a politician, but more as a professor. So I began listening to him, reading his books, and that's how I got more involved into politics at the beginning.
You mentioned briefly baseball. What is it about the Dominican Republic that produces so many great baseball players, more than any other Latin American nation?
Well, really, it's a miracle what we have had, no? The possibility of having Dominican ball players get into the major leagues in the 60s, they opened the door for the others. And now we have Major League Baseball academics operating in the Dominican Republic, about 24 of them. So just about every Major League Baseball team has an academic in the Dominican Republic. And some of our youngsters are signed as young as 16 years of age, 17 years of age. Where Sandy Alcantara won the Cy Young Award last year best patron national league. And so yes, Dominican, we call it baseball lands. Dominican Republic is baseball lands, really.
What role do you think government needs to play, a government like the Dominican government, in promoting things like the arts, sports, areas where in the US, for example, the government is not really involved?
Well, in our case, government has to play a very active and dynamic role because the private sector is not as developed as it is in a developed country, so government really takes care of that. In sports, related to sports, we have a sports ministry. And my sports minister was Juan Marichal. So you see how things connect. I used to see him playing here in the States, and then when I was able to when I was elected, then I appointed him as the first minister of sports because of his prestige and because of his connections here in the U.S. And I would say Dominican Republic is not only good in baseball, we're good in volleyball, we're very good in boxing, we're very good in softball, in martial arts, in football now. Well, we're beginning. We don't have a Pelé there yet, but eventually.
Not yet.
And so we say that Dominican Republic is not a world power, it is not a military power, it is not an economic powerhouse, but we are a sports powerhouse worldwide because we go to the Olympics, we get gold medals and silver medals, so it's a source of pride for the Dominican Republic to be so good in different sports.
Another area where the Dominican Republic really has excelled is in stability. For decades, the Dominican Republic has been remarkably stable politically, but also economically. We have a lot of students studying Latin America politics, and they would know that we have some regimes in Latin America that are politically stable, but economically unstable. Others that are politically unstable, but economically fairly stable. I think Peru comes to mind. Others that are politically unstable and economically unstable. Right. But the Dominican Republic is a model of political stability and economic stability. Since you were president the first time, there have been presidents of other parties, yet the macroeconomic stability has been remarkable. You welcome foreign investments regardless of who's in charge. What is the secret to that Dominican stability, both political and economic?
Right. We have gone through stages. Right after Trujillo's death, our main goal was freedom and democracy. We had the first experiment, as we said before, but it failed. The Bosch regime, the coup d'etat, the military uprising, it failed. Then we had Balaguer, Joaquin Balaguer, who has become a legend in Dominican politics. He governed from 66 to 78.
Into his 90s.
Until his 90s and blind.
Yeah, and blind.
And blind. So we had a blind president in the Dominican Republic. But brilliant man, great scholar, magnificent public speaker, like no one else. He would quote on the Greeks and the Romans out of the top of his head. So a very, very highly educated, cultivated man. As any politician, history will judge finally, but my belief is that it's more positive than negative, what he did for the country. Those 12 years, there was economic growth. The economy was expanding, even though politically it was semi-authoritarian, I would say that. So modern democracy in the Dominican Republic begins in 1978. We had free and fair elections at the time. I think President Jimmy Carter, we spoke about this before, influenced the Dominican electoral outcome in 1978. When President Carter came to office, he promoted a policy of human rights and free and fair elections in Latin America, and I think that had an impact in our countries, alongside with other elements, other factors that were taking place outside the region. Remember that it was not only the Dominican Republic, but in the 60s and 70s, there were military coup d'etats everywhere, in Brazil, in Argentina, in Chile, everywhere. And politics was framed in terms of these are fascist governments, and we're struggling for a socialist transition. So it was either capitalism or socialism at the time. But many of these political leaders that were persecuted by the military regimes, they traveled over to Europe. Many stayed in Spain, others in Germany, others in Sweden, Switzerland. And at the time, I think three major events took place that influenced the Latin American leadership and the Dominican Republic political leadership as well. It was the death of Francisco Franco in Spain. This took place in 1876. And with the death of Francisco Franco, a democratic transition began to take place in Spain. Many Latin American leaders living in Spain at the time say, well, this makes sense. I think we can perhaps do the same thing in Latin America. So instead of fascism versus socialism, it became dictatorship versus democracy. The other was the fall of the military in Greece. And at the end also the fall of the family, the Salazar family in Portugal. Right? Another major element is when the socialist institution, el socialismo international socialism, in Europe was more Eurocentric. They opened the door, so traditional Latin American political parties would participate within the international socialists. And then you had leaders like François Mitterrand in France, Willy Brandt in Germany, and so they became interested in Latin American politics, and they influenced. So it was Carter, human rights policy, and free, fair elections. It was the European process of ending dictatorships and pivoting into democracies. Latin American political leaders were there, they were influenced, they came back, and then they had a new mindset about where the political struggle should move into. So the Dominican Republic was the first location, the first country in Latin America that made that transition, right, in 1978. And from there on, we've had free, fair elections for the last 40 plus years. So we have been able to understand, and I think there is a consensus among all political parties in the Dominican Republic, there's a consensus that you need to have stable democratic political system in order to have economic growth and have socio-economic development. And we can see the difference between Dominican Republic and our neighbor, Haiti. The problem with Haiti is that it doesn't have a democratic political stability system. It is undemocratic, it is unstable, and because of that, there's a lot of poverty, a lack of opportunities. And so we see that the solving current problems in Haiti needs to go by first stabilizing politically, creating democratic institutions. So if you have that, there will be confidence in investing in the country. Private, local investments, foreign direct investment in the country. And then we were also making a transition in terms of economic development. Dominican Republic, as just about every country in Latin America, were export-led countries. In our case, sugar, coffee, tobacco, etc. In the 70s and 80s, then there was a transformation more into a service-oriented economy. So we began promoting tourism, free trade zones, and free trade zones is manufacturing, but more export-led. So in those corporations, you would manufacture apparels, footwear, plastics, medical equipment, etc., and basically export it into the U.S. market on a duty-free basis. Originally, in the 70s and 80s, there was a program called the Caribbean Basin Initiative, CBI. And with CBI, we would export into the U.S. market textiles, apparel, and these other products I was speaking about. They would enter the U.S. market on a duty-free basis, unilaterally. So we didn't have to open our economy to import goods and services from the U.S. Now, in the 90s, at the end of the Cold War, the whole program was changed, and now it's bilateral. So we are part of what is called DR-CAFTA, Dominican Republic, Central American Free Trade Agreement, and because of that, we continue to export into the U.S. market, and now we also import from the U.S. market. Many products also duty-free. So this is how it plays out. So we have tourism and free trade zones and growth within the financial sector, commerce, and this has enabled the creation of an expanding middle class in the Dominican Republic. Another major factor is Dominicans abroad, especially here in the States. We have nearly 2 million Dominicans in the United States. We are 11 Dominicans back home.
Y dice el pueblo, nuestro senador se llama Salvador Holguín. Pa' que mi pueblo esté mejor, me voy con Salvador. Pa' que mi pueblo esté mejor, me voy con Salvador. Pa' que mi pueblo esté mejor, me voy con Salvador. Pa' que mi pueblo esté mejor, me voy con Salvador. esté mejor. Me voy con Salvador. Pa' que mi pueblo esté mejor. Me voy con Salvador. Pa' que mi pueblo esté mejor. Me voy con Salvador. Aquí todos estamos claros. Ganará, ganará. Tiene el triunfo asegurado. Ganará, ganará. Se dice en todos los lados. Ganará, ganará. Que es el más capacitado. Ganará, ganará. Y se dice que en Cañongo. Ganará, ganará. En Santiago de la Cruz. Ganará, ganará. Y en Capotillo se dice. Ganará, ganará. Y también en Manuel Bueno. Pa' que mi pueblo esté mejor. Me voy con Salvador. Pa' que mi pueblo esté mejor. Me voy con Salvador. Pa' que mi pueblo esté mejor. Me voy con Salvador. Pa' que mi pueblo esté mejor. Me voy con Salvador. ¡Ah! En el municipio de Partido. La Cagola, Sangre Linda, La Gorra, Aminilla, Paso Tapao, Sabana en Medio, Los Campos, El Llano. ¡Uy! La gente del Pino, Plan 1 y 2, El Limón, El Rodeo y El Fango. Todos están con Salvador Holguín, senador. Y en Restauración, Los Cerezos, La Rosa, Mariano Cetero, Cruz de Cabrera y Montehigo. ¿Qué es lo que dice el coro? Salvador pa' aquí, Salvador pa' allá. Que por Salvador que todo el mundo va a votar. Salvador pa' aquí, Salvador pa' allá. Que por Salvador que todo el mundo va a votar. En la colonia japonesa ganará, ganará. En la aviación y el cayuco ganará, ganará. La pastilla y Candelón ganará, ganará. Palo Blanco y Ayagüey ganará, ganará. En Villa Alegre y Los Arroyos ganará, ganará. En Corra Grande y en Los Minches ganará, ganará. En Tamarindo y Don Miguel ganará, ganará. La Tres Palmas y La Peñita. Pa' que mi pueblo esté mejor. Me voy con Salvador. Pa' que mi pueblo esté mejor. Me voy con Salvador. Pa' que mi pueblo esté mejor. Me voy con Salvador. Pa' que mi pueblo esté mejor. Me voy con Salvador. ¡Ja! No hay duda de que se va, se va. Salvador, próximo senador.
Porque creemos en el desarrollo de los pueblos y su gente, la Fundación Salvador Holguín da apertura a los cursos técnicos de electricidad, plomería, electrónica, reparación y fabricación de inversores totalmente gratis. Tu aporte solo es asistir a recibir las enseñanzas de profesores especializados en el área. Ya no hay justificación. Si no eres profesional o no tienes una carrera técnica, esta es tu oportunidad. La Fundación Salvador Holguín te espera con las puertas abiertas en el Pino de Jabón. Inscríbete al 849-457-4226.
George pasó y teníamos aproximadamente 10 años viviendo en la zona y nos mudamos en la misma semana porque la casa donde vivíamos fue destrozada por el ciclón. No teníamos agua en la casa, teníamos la tubería porque un vecino nos la prestó y era muy difícil para nosotros en crisis de agua no tener un agua directa. Una casa sin agua no se puede estar. El país ha cambiado. Esta gestión vinieron al barrio y nos pusieron el agua directamente en la tubería y ya nosotros tenemos agua, podemos lavar cuando queramos, limpiar la casa cuando queramos sin necesidad de tener el agua medida. Sentí el cambio.
Soy pescador de la provincia de Puerto Plata y me desempeño como vendedor artesanal en el área de la Puntilla y Malecón. Con la pandemia, la crisis de nosotros se agudizó mucho más. No teníamos nada de qué depender, no teníamos turismo, no teníamos pesca, no teníamos comida, no teníamos cómo subsistir. La estábamos pasando extremadamente mal. Cuando cambiaron las autoridades, pues las cosas vinieron floreciendo. Se inauguró un puerto turístico, ahí no veis, se le construyó el puerto de pesca a los pescadores, empezaron a llegar más turistas y hemos ido saliendo hacia adelante poco a poco. Sentimos el cambio, sentimos el renacer de Puerto Plata.
tenemos un propósito que marcará un antes y un después en la historia de la República Dominicana. Despachar la mercancía que llega a nuestros puertos en 24 horas. Es un trabajo en equipo, un desafío que solo se puede enfrentar con entusiasmo y valentía. Nuestras aduanas están equipándose con los últimos avances tecnológicos porque solo con modernidad y eficiencia podremos agilizar los procesos operativos. Es un gran reto, pero si unimos nuestras voluntades, juntos podremos lograrlo.
Esta iniciativa impactará los índices de competitividad de nuestro país, favorecerá el comercio exterior y mejorará la calidad de vida de nuestra gente. Nos encaminamos a ser el hub logístico de la región. Es un propósito donde ganamos todos, pero sobre todo ganamos como país.
Despacho en 24 horas. Juntos a tiempo. Dirección General de Aduanas.
Con la brisita navideña vienen los mercados económicos de Inespre, con los productos básicos de la canasta familiar y los ingredientes de la cena navideña a precios justos, para que tengas una Navidad más feliz. Primero tu familia, primero tu alegría, primero tu Navidad.
¿Buscas un espacio a tu medida? Encuentra el camino a tu casa con Expogar Banreservas, con tasas desde 7% y las mejores condiciones para que puedas adquirir esa casa, villa o local propio. Banreservas, el banco de todos los dominicanos.
Aquí, en la provincia de Santiago,
esto es Cambio.
Imagínate tú, no es fácil.
Nadie nos hacía caso.
Después de tener más de 12 años en la comunidad abandonada,
nuestros barrios que daban pena.
Claro, el cambio se siente desde que Luis Abinader tomó las riendas de nuestro país.
Teníamos varios años esperando la terminación del tramo de la circunvalación norte. Es un tramo que nos ayuda a descentralizarnos de la ciudad y en el cual nos da una potencial muy alta, tanto de trabajo, porque ya no es una promesa, es una realidad. Son 77 barrios que se han comunicado directamente. Nos dignifica como personas y aparte que nuestro entorno coge más valor y nuestra propiedad.
Nos encontramos en el puente Abraham Gómez. Teníamos un largo tiempo ansiosos por este puente.
Este puente comunica la autopista Duarte con Laguna Prieta, Puñal y Guayabal. Cuenta con todos los elementos estructurales y las especificaciones técnicas que debe contar con un puente metálico.
Desde el 2008 no se le daba un remozamiento a esta arena y estamos más que agradecidos, tanto como santiagueros y como presidente de la Asociación de Baloncesto de Santiago.
Los santiagueros estamos orgullosos de esta gestión porque
se siente el calor del gobierno ayudando a su gente.
Esto es Cambio.
De aquí voy yo para donde María a buscar el dinero, de ahí paso al banco a pagar la tarjeta de crédito, a pagar la multa que me pusieron y a ver si Michael ya me mandó el dinero. Ay, Rosita, date prisa que yo estoy demasiado tarde.
Tú te vas a complicar, mija. No, hombre, no, mira. Esos pagos, la multa también y las remesas, lo resuelves todos en tu agente Banreservas, todo de un pronto y sin pagar comisión, more. Con tantas soluciones a mano, ¿por qué hay que complicarse?
No te compliques y utiliza los canales Banreservas, tu banco fuera del banco. Banreservas, el banco de todos los dominicanos.
La Cámara de Diputados, en cumplimiento de sus atribuciones, aprobó leyes de gran impacto social, realizó vistas públicas, talleres, descensos y al menos 28 de sus comisiones trabajaron. La Comisión de Dominicanos en el Exterior realizó vistas públicas en Miami y San Juan, Puerto Rico, donde reconocieron a personalidades que han hecho aportes significativos al país. La comisión fue encabezada por Alfredo Pacheco, quien estuvo acompañado de Ramón Ceballo, Eddie Montaz, Adelis Olivares, Josefa Mejía, Héctor Félix y Máximo Castro. Mientras que en las sesiones de la semana, el Pleno aprobó en primera lectura el proyecto de agricultura familiar que busca que se haga efectivo el derecho humano a una alimentación adecuada y suficiente. También aprobó una resolución entre el gobierno dominicano y el de Guatemala para que los dependientes del personal diplomático puedan realizar actividades remuneradas. Y una comisión especial realizó vistas públicas sobre el proyecto de Ley General de Alquileres de Bienes Inmuebles y Desahucios.
Cámara de Diputados de la República Dominicana.
Vamos a ver si yo sé hacer trenza, mija, ¿ves? ¿Tú estás nerviosa?
¿Y por qué?
Bueno, mija, ya son 14, ya tú eres una mujer vieja. Yo a tu edad ya le tenía limpio el ranchito a tu pai y andaba contigo en la barriga.
¿Y por qué?
¿Cómo que por qué, mija? Los hombres esperan que tú sepas hacerlo todo en la casa.
Pero, ¿por qué?
Mira, mi mamá decía, tú tienes que atender al marido, parir muchacho, cocinar y limpiar. Eso de estudio y universidad, eso no era para nosotras. Eso decía la gente en mi tiempo.
¿Por qué?
Porque eso fue lo que nos tocó. Es que no había otra opción.
¿Por qué?
Mira, ahora que tú me lo dices, mija, hasta yo quisiera saber por qué.
No hay un porqué. Las uniones tempranas les roban a las niñas y adolescentes la libertad de desarrollar todo su potencial y elegir un mejor futuro.
En Los Ríos estamos ejecutando una obra que se llama el saneamiento pluvial y sanitario de la cañada de Arroyo Hondo. Hemos alcanzado ya el sellado de la cañada.
En los 35 años que tengo viviendo aquí, primer presidente viene aquí a la cañada. Desde que empezaba a llover estaba todo el mundo de pie y con la cama amarrada en soga.
Teníamos una precariedad con esta cañada, eso era insoportable.
Una vez uno a las 12 de la noche tenía que levantarse a ayudar a los vecinos, a meterse al agua porque se inundaba todo.
Llegó el cambio al sector de nosotros Los Ríos, ya prácticamente eso ya está pasando a la historia.
Ya no le decimos cañada, le decimos la ex cañada.
Nosotros tenemos ya un presidente que se duele por nosotros, que nos ha escuchado.
Mucha diferencia. Ahora cuando llueve uno se siente asombrado porque ni siquiera ve el agua cruzar. Está uno prácticamente en un paraíso.
Se resuelve un problema de salubridad, se resuelve un problema de derramamientos de agua, de crecida de las cañadas. Alcanzar lo que hemos hecho en esta etapa, esto es cambio.
Ya los niños juegan, no tenemos susto de que está lloviendo y vamos a tener que salir corriendo de aquí porque lo estamos disfrutando bastante, nos sentamos en la tarde, nos recreamos.
Ya todos los domingos, los fines de semana lo vamos a compartir todo en familia aquí, ya ustedes saben.
Cuando el país se cerró, eso fue un boom. Yo no sé ni cómo explicarle porque míreme, como yo me vi, yo no se lo deseo a nadie. Cuando abrieron todo, ahí yo salí a buscar empleo y gracias a Dios conseguí. Gracias a la política de recuperación de empleo pre-COVID, pude obtener mi trabajo y gracias a Dios también a la tarjeta Progresando con Solidaridad del Canal Supérate, que de esta tarjeta obtuve mi gas, mi compra y hasta bono luz. El país yo lo veo que va muy bien. Lo que Luis Abinader hizo, son pocos que lo hacen, porque no es cualquier presidente que entra en plena pandemia y hace todo lo que él ha hecho. Mi vida ha cambiado de una manera.
Aquí, en la provincia de Duarte.
Esto es Cambio.
La provincia de Duarte es una provincia maravillosa.
La gente de aquí somos todas trabajadoras, buenas y serviciales.
En otro tiempo, verdaderamente fuimos abandonados.
Realmente era un caos.
Pero después que nuestro presidente Luis Abinader llegó,
nosotros estamos dentro del cambio, de ese cambio que el presidente soñó.
Nos encontramos en la provincia de Duarte, en donde el gobierno central, a través del Ministerio de Obras Públicas, ha venido realizando un conjunto de ejecutorias para mejorar la calidad de vida de los habitantes de esta provincia.
Y se están cumpliendo los trabajos a capa y espada. Antes esto era intransitable.
Porque imagínate, si antes era mucho polvo y un desastre.
Hoy día, esta vía no está en una maqueta, esto es un diseño realizado.
En tiempos atrás solamente había un beneficiario del puente Huiza, que era el río, porque cada vez que hacían un puentecito lo hacían malo y se iba. Esa obra para nosotros ha sido una obra maravillosa. Vimos realidad este sueño.
Y miren, 2 años aquí se ha faltado, a donde quiera.
Ahora podemos salir en los vehículos, llegamos más a tiempo y nuestros vehículos no se deterioran. Y agradecidos estamos como comunitarios por eso.
También tenemos lo que es la reconstrucción, el asfaltado de la carretera de Controva hacia San Francisco, así previendo accidentes y mejorando la seguridad vial de la misma.
Esto que ustedes están viendo hoy aquí es solo una pincelada de lo que está haciendo el gobierno en la provincia de Duarte.
Aquí,
en la provincia de Duarte.
Esto es cambio.
La provincia de Duarte es una provincia maravillosa.
La gente de aquí somos todas trabajadoras, buenas y serviciales.
En otro tiempo, verdaderamente fuimos abandonados.
Realmente era un caos.
Pero después que nuestro presidente Luis Abinader llegó,
nosotros estamos dentro del cambio, de ese cambio que el presidente soñó.
Nos encontramos en la provincia de Duarte, en donde el gobierno central, a través del Ministerio de Obras Públicas, ha venido realizando un conjunto de ejecutorias para mejorar la calidad de vida de los habitantes de esta provincia.
Y se están cumpliendo los trabajos a capa y espada.
Antes esto era intransitable.
Porque imagínate, si antes era mucho polvo y un desastre.
Hoy día, esta vía no está en una maqueta, esto es un diseño realizado.
En tiempos atrás solamente había un beneficiario del puente Huiza, que era el río, porque cada vez que hacían un puentecito lo hacían malo y se iba. Esa obra para nosotros ha sido una obra maravillosa. Vimos realidad este sueño.
Y miren, 2 años aquí se ha faltado, a donde quiera.
Ahora podemos salir en los vehículos, llegamos más a tiempo y nuestros vehículos no se deterioran. Y agradecidos estamos como comunitarios por eso.
También tenemos lo que es la reconstrucción, el asfaltado de la carretera de Controva hacia San Francisco, así previendo accidentes y mejorando la seguridad vial de la misma.
Esto que ustedes están viendo hoy aquí es solo una pincelada de lo que está haciendo el gobierno en la provincia de Duarte.
Hey, campeón, ven acá, mi muchacho. Ya tú tienes un corito por ahí. No te pongas a perder tiempo de que con una sola. Consíguete varias. Mientras más tú tengas, mucho mejor.
¿Y por qué?
Para que tú tengas opción. Yo hice lo mismo. Con la edad te consigo una muchachita. Y que sea una menor.
¿Por qué?
Chiquitica es que hay que buscarla. De que se pongan a pensar de que en estudio y en trabajo. Para enseñarle quién es que manda.
¿Por qué?
Eso fue lo que nos enseñó mi papá a mí y a mis hermanos. Y todito hicimos lo mismo.
¿Por qué?
Ahora que tú lo dices, hasta yo quiero saber por qué.
No hay un porqué. Las uniones tempranas les roban a los niños, niñas y adolescentes la libertad de desarrollar todo su potencial y elegir un mejor futuro.
Nearly 2 million Dominicans in the United States. We are 11 Dominicans back home, 2 million more abroad. And it's interesting because in the last census, what we see is that those 2 million, 1.1 million were born in the States, and only now 900,000 migrated to the United States. So what we see as a trend is that looking into the future, we'll have more children born of Dominican parents living in the States. This has also made a great contribution to the country because they send remittances, they send financial resources to the families and to the ties back home. Last year was record, $10 billion were sent by Dominicans living here to Dominicans at home. So it's tourism, it's free trade zones, it is remittances, and traveling, and all this has made a tremendous transformation into the Dominican Republic.
You mentioned the military dictatorships. For
couple of decades, you had a bunch of military dictatorships in Latin America. Then beginning in the 80s, we see that democracy began to arrive in many of these areas that had dictatorships. And we saw a new wave of democracies emerge all over Latin America. And so there was a lot of promise for democracy. People believed that democracy was the solution to Latin America. Now what we're seeing is that there's a bunch of regimes throughout Latin America that were elected initially democratically, Cuba, the clear exception, but others that were initially democratically elected regimes that have gone the authoritarian route and that have tried to remain in power repeatedly, whether you call them populist or a different type of regime, most of them on the left. Do you think democracy has lost its luster? Are we seeing a return, maybe not to authoritarianism the old-fashioned way through dictatorships, but a new type of authoritarianism emerging in Latin America?
In a way, yes. Even though I think democracy still prevails in general terms, I would say those with authoritarian inclinations are the exception. Just about the rest of the countries are more democratically centered. The rule of law, constitutionalism, I think that prevails still today. Now, the thing is, who comes into power nowadays depends on global trends, global economic trends, and the influence they're having in the electoral political cycle in Latin America. This is something relatively new. We've always known that there is a correlation between economics and politics. If the economy is doing well, and the government tends to be reelected. If there is a downfall in the economy, most likely the opposition will come into power. But that used to be on the local terms. Now it's globally. Global economic trends define political electoral cycles in Latin America. So when the democratic left, I should call it, is not the armed left, it's not a revolution. They came elected by the people, no? This democratic left or center left in Latin America came into office due to the recession that began to take place in 2001. That's what explains that Lula won the elections in 2002 and all the others, because there was an economic situation that was having a negative impact. There was rising prices in foods specifically, unemployment, a lot of marginalized people in the urban areas. So that enabled democratic left parties to come into power. Now they were lucky enough that once in office, China began growing at 12% average annually, something extraordinary. And China began demanding natural resources that we have in the region, oil, natural gas, copper, soybeans, etc. So China was buying all of these products. And so for the first time, these governments, especially in South America, were having enough resources that they can invest in social policies. So they were investing more in education, investing more in healthcare. And so people were, I would say, supporting massively these governments. They got reelected many times. They had an enormous popularity, right? And it took a whole decade, from 2003 to 2013. And they call this the golden decade economically in Latin America. But beginning in 2014, it was the other way around. So China began lowering its economic growth. There was less demand of commodities coming from Latin America. And from 2014 to 2019, the year before the pandemic, there was a downfall in Latin America's economy. It only grew 0.5. While in the previous decade, from 2003 to 2013, it grew 5.5%, then a downfall to 0.5%. And so those governments that came into office or that were in office, they lost the upcoming elections. So in the last 14 elections that has taken place in Latin America, from 2014 to 2022, all governments have lost elections, with the exception of Nicaragua, because the president jailed all his opponents. So
every one of them.
Every one of them, right? So he didn't win in a fair way. So this is.
So you think it's cyclical?
It's cyclical. I think politics is like a pendulum. It's like a pendulum in Latin America, more dependent nowadays of global economic trends. In our case, the Dominican Republic, we're more connected to the U.S. We're more connected to the U.S. system. If the economy is doing well in the U.S., then it has a positive impact in the Dominican Republic. For example, what is taking place at this moment? Because of stimulus programs put in place here in the U.S. after the pandemic, consumers are buying more here in the U.S. If you go to shopping malls, you see people buying all the time. If they buy shoes, if they buy clothing, most of this is manufactured in countries like the Dominican Republic. So employment has risen in the Dominican Republic due to U.S. consumption, right? So this is helpful. But at the same time, there is inflation. And if the Federal Reserve increases rates, Dominican Republic has necessarily to increase rates at the same time. Why? Because if the central bank doesn't increase the rates, then there will be a capital flight from the Dominican Republic trying to station where they will get more return. So it's all connected. 92 central banks around the world are doing the same thing, increasing rates, interest rates, right? So there is a connection there. Now, if you raise interest rates to bring down inflation, most likely you're going to slow economic growth. And if you have to continue raising interest rates, at some point there will be a recession. And if there is a recession, whoever is in power will lose the next elections.
Now, of all the countries we talked about, there's three that have remained authoritarian for a long time. One, Cuba, 64 years. Venezuela, a quarter of a century. And Nicaragua, whether you count the first in the 80s, the first period of Ortega, or the recent one, even more. The Dominican Republic, again, has been a model of stability, democracy, free markets. Is there a role for the Dominican Republic to play in perhaps bringing these countries on the democratic side? Well, and if so, what should that be?
I think we began playing that role during my administration when there was a crisis between Venezuela, Colombia, and Ecuador. Colombian troops entered Ecuadorian soil, persecuting members of the militia groups, members of the guerrilla groups. Colombian guerrilla groups supposedly operating from Ecuador. So we had a meeting by what is called then the Summit of Rio de Janeiro in the Dominican Republic, and there was a quarrel between these three countries. Even they were going to file a lawsuit in The Hague, no, for violation of human rights and whatever. So we were able to solve that problem in a diplomatic way. And so we left the meeting with the idea that the Dominican Republic could play a role of mediating on conflicts within countries in the region. I remember the president from Honduras saying, Santo Domingo is the capital of peace in Latin America. And then some other conflicts came about and we were able to solve that, especially Honduras. When there was a military coup against President Zelaya, I had to go and travel, being president of the Dominican Republic, to rescue Zelaya, who was in exile in the Brazilian embassy, but under threat that would be killed by the Honduran military. And so we were playing the role of mediating conflicts in the region. But successive governments have not been up to the occasion, and I think we have abandoned the idea of being neutral in order to solve problems within the region that no one else could solve, because there's in some cases lack of trust on OAS, the Organization of American States. They don't trust what takes place there. They say it is influenced by the US and Canada. They want to have something more Latin American. And there is no resource, there's no, I would say, third party on which you can rely to solve these conflicts that come about now and then among
And so going forward, what do you think the Dominican Republic can do to bring democracy to these three countries in particular?
Well, we can only show our example. That the Dominican Republic has progressed, that we have modernized our country with democratic political stability, and that's the only way that can be done. And I think people are beginning to understand that. Because I would say this, Carlos, right from the Declaration of Independence of our countries at the beginning of the 19th century, the goal always was to establish democratic regimes, but we were never able to. The 19th century was always a struggle between caudillismos in different places. We never were able to, with some exceptions. Then entering the 20th century was the Mexican Revolution, I think made an impact in terms of eliminating dictatorship of the time, Porfirio Diaz, and having a democracy with its flaws, because a one-party democracy for many years. Now, Mexico has different political parties. It's a plural party political system. Well, you have Mexico. And then some of Chile at some point up to Allende, when then there was a coup, and then you had Pinochet for many years, and now Chile once again is within the democratic, circle. At some point you have a democratic Christian president, another time you have a socialist president. Now we have a young, very young socialist president, but he has to operate within the framework and the limits of a democratic constitution. So it's important to have the rule of law, and everybody has to respect that rule of law. Otherwise,
Absolutely.
he creates a condition to be ousted from government, as recently has happened in Peru. When the president came out, he said he was going to dissolve the Congress. He couldn't step out of the door.
Right.
I think it was a self-inflicted coup that took place in that location. So with Cuba, we have to perhaps understand the historical moment. Cuba really was never democratic. Cuba was the last country to achieve independence at the end of the 19th century, 1898. And Cubans felt that they were mediated by the U.S., that the U.S. played a very active intervening role in Cuba, and so Cubans never understood there was really a democracy there. Juan Bosch, my mentor, lived in Cuba for over 25 years as an exile, and he was a consultant to President Carlos Prío Socarrás, the only democratic president prior to the revolution in 1959. So the revolution in Cuba took place in a moment where there were many other dictatorships in the region, and there was no democratic path to overcome those regimes. So Fidel Castro led the revolution in Cuba in 1959. Some Dominicans participated in that revolution with Fidel Castro. The revolution in Cuba triumphed in January 1959, and we had an expedition, a military expedition, coming out of Cuba in June 1959, 6 months later, with people that were trained and participated in the guerrilla with Fidel Castro coming to the Dominican Republic to overthrow Trujillo, the 14th of June movement. So at the time, when the Cuban Revolution took place, the idea was there's no other way because the democratic path has been obstructed. We have to do it by revolution. And so Fidel was seen as a hero in Latin America at the time. When Juan Bosch was overthrown by a coup d'etat, and then there was a popular uprising in 1965, and U.S. military took over, people of my generation that began participating in politics, they thought that the only way out was going to be through a revolution. So the revolutionary phenomenon is something that must be understood in the context of the historical process at the time. Now, once you are able to get into power through the democratic system, revolution doesn't make sense. So revolution has become something obsolete. The revolution that's taking place nowadays in the 21st century is the revolution of knowledge, science, and technology. And that's the only way that we can also move forward in Latin America through knowledge, through science, through technology transfer, so that we can increase our productivity, our competitiveness in international trade, and create a volume of wealth that, well distributed, will make our countries modern countries in Latin America and around the world.
You mentioned China very briefly. Some would argue that the United States for a long time has ignored Latin America, and that by creating a vacuum, the Chinese have been able to step in, and right now they are South America's biggest investor, biggest trading partner, and the second for Latin America. Were it not for Mexico, where U.S. trade is key, it would be the biggest in Latin America. Are you concerned about the Chinese in Latin America, A, and B, if so, what should U.S. foreign policy look like so that the U.S. has a bigger, stronger, more robust presence in the region?
I think the U.S. was more concerned and involved in Latin America because of the Cuban Revolution. And then you had President Kennedy talk about the Alliance for Progress. It was a response to the Cuban Revolution. But then in the 1980s, as the dictatorships gave way to democratic governments, I think there was a neglect from the U.S. Policymakers in terms of the importance Latin America had for foreign affairs, for the U.S. foreign affairs. I think there was some sort of neglect in understanding the importance of Latin America. Now, the Chinese began coming into the region more the 90s and the beginning of this century, especially in South America. And I would say this neglect or indifference came more from the economic side. U.S. multinationals began abandoning Latin America. They thought that Latin American countries were too small, not enough population to buy goods and services from the U.S. U.S. companies, on the other hand, began going to China, investing in China, right? The industrial belt up in Northeast, I know that because we have many Dominicans living, for example, in Providence and Lawrence. This used to be manufacturing places, no? Ghost cities nowadays. Those companies went to China. And they went to China because they saw China had a huge population, 1.4 billion, so they're going to be consumers, they're going to buy American products manufactured in China. Dominican Republic only has 11 million people, you know, not enough population to buy goods and services for America. So all these companies left, or the majority of these companies left. You don't find one US company doing infrastructure development in Latin America. I don't know of anyone. And so Chinese companies began overtaking US market in South America, not in the Caribbean. In the Caribbean, US always had a tighter connection, and it's just been recently because Taiwan was unable to really deliver in terms of connecting the Latin American countries with investments coming from Taiwan. Taiwan was also investing in China. Taiwanese companies were going to China. So the Taiwanese government was interested in having a relationship with our government, but the Taiwanese private sector made no investments. They were still aiding. Yeah? We'll give you ambulances, or we'll build a hospital for you. Well, we have become middle-class income countries. We don't need this type of aid anymore. We want investments. So the Taiwanese or the US companies were not investing. The Chinese come in, they say, we're going to build this for you, we're going to do the other thing, and so they become attractive. I think the US has reacted lately, I would say, to the penetration of China in this part of the world, but still early enough. Still, I think the US has a geopolitical interest.
Convencidos en que la tecnología e información son garantías de éxito y desarrollo de las personas en la era digital, la Fundación Salvador Holguín trae totalmente gratis a tu provincia de Jabón los cursos de informática e inglés para ponerte acorde con los tiempos y garantizar la capacitación y profesionalidad de sus compueblanos. Ya están abiertas las inscripciones. Llama ahora mismo al 849-457-4226. Fundación Salvador Holguín. Tecnología a tu alcance.
Tenemos un propósito que marcará un antes y un después en la historia de la República Dominicana. Despachar la mercancía que llega a nuestros puertos en 24 horas. Es un trabajo en equipo. Un desafío que solo se puede enfrentar con entusiasmo y valentía. Nuestras aduanas están equipándose con los últimos avances tecnológicos porque solo con modernidad y eficiencia podremos agilizar los procesos operativos. Es un gran reto, pero si unimos nuestras voluntades, juntos podremos lograrlo.
Esta iniciativa impactará los índices de competitividad de nuestro país, favorecerá el comercio exterior y mejorará la calidad de vida de nuestra gente. Nos encaminamos a ser el hub logístico de la región. Es un propósito donde ganamos todos, pero sobre todo ganamos como país.
Despacho en 24 horas. Juntos a tiempo. Dirección General de Aduanas.
Me hice a puro golpe bailarín. Mi sueño es tener mi escuela de baile para dar clases de belly dance y zumba. Cuando entró la pandemia, los trabajos estaban difíciles. Trabajaba en una compañía de limpieza. Yo aprendí a lavar colchones, piso, alfombra. Por la pandemia la quitaron la empresa y me quedé aquí en la casa. Mi casa era de madera, tenía caicoma, cuando llovía se mojaba todo. El INVI vino y me ayudaron a construir mi casita. Mi vida cambió cuando arreglaron mi casita, porque no se moja. En República Dominicana los sueños se hacen realidad tocando puertas.
Aquí,
en la provincia de Duarte.
Esto es cambio.
La provincia de Duarte es una provincia maravillosa.
La gente de aquí somos todas trabajadoras, buenas y serviciales.
En otro tiempo, verdaderamente fuimos abandonados.
Realmente era un caos.
Pero después que nuestro presidente Luis Abinader llegó,
nosotros estamos dentro del cambio, de ese cambio que el presidente soñó.
Nos encontramos en la provincia de Duarte, en donde el gobierno central, a través del Ministerio de Obras Públicas, ha venido realizando un conjunto de ejecutorias para mejorar la calidad de vida de los habitantes de esta provincia.
Y se están cumpliendo los trabajos a capa y espada.
Antes esto era intransitable.
Porque imagínate, si antes era mucho polvo y un desastre.
Hoy día esta vía no está en una maqueta, esto es un diseño realizado.
En tiempos atrás solamente había un beneficiario del puente Guisa, que era el río, porque cada vez que hacían un puentecito lo hacían malo y se iba. Esa obra para nosotros ha sido una obra maravillosa. Vimos realidad este sueño.
Y miren, 2 años aquí se ha faltado, a donde quiera.
Ahora podemos salir en los vehículos, llegamos más a tiempo y nuestros vehículos no se deterioran. Y agradecidos estamos como comunitarios por eso.
También tenemos lo que es la reconstrucción, el asfaltado de la carretera de Controva hacia San Francisco, así previendo accidentes y mejorando la seguridad vial de la misma.
Esto que ustedes están viendo hoy aquí es solo una pincelada de lo que está haciendo el gobierno en la provincia de Duarte.
Vi que por una mujer bombero se salvaron 2 niños, entonces de ahí empezó el yo querer ser bombera. Yo soy de la que digo que eso no se toma de la noche a la mañana, sino que uno nace con ese don de querer ayudar. La casa estaba en una situación fea, que no se la deseamos a nadie. No tenían baño, los cines estaban de un lado despegados, todas las tablas, la mayoría todas estaban en el suelo. Me llamaron